Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Reich, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations: Pathways to Action. The National Academies provide independent, objective advice to inform policy with evidence, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. In keeping with this mission, we're excited to host these conversations about issues relevant to policy action on climate change. I'd like to acknowledge that the National Academy's Washington, D.C. headquarters is physically housed on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have been its stewards throughout the generations. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land, and acknowledge that the expertise held by different Native communities is crucial to the work of understanding and addressing climate change. Today, we'll talk about how to better incorporate climate into the economic models used in policymaking. Our conversation will be recorded, and you can view it right here, right after the event. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them in the box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them in a dedicated Q&A period in the final half hour. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in that same location, and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. Above, you'll also see a link to sign up for our weekly newsletter about all the upcoming climate activities at the academies, and links for two specific upcoming events. October 31st, we're holding the second annual Ramanathan Climate Conversation, which will be about how to reduce the impact of climate-worsened floods in Asia. And November 1st and 2nd, we're holding a workshop on the dynamics of climate and the macroeconomy that'll get into a lot more detail about the topics we're talking about today. So please join that workshop if you're interested in this area. I'm really grateful to be joined by Eric Kemp-Benedict, a senior economist and director of the Equitable Transitions Program at the Stockholm Environment Institute's U.S. Center. Eric is going to introduce the conversationalists and moderate the event. Thank you again for joining the National Academies for Climate Conversations. Eric, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome everyone. Just to set the stage a little bit, I'm going to say something I think we're all aware of, that we've been seeing stronger and stronger climate impacts in the US and around the globe, with record levels of disasters and extreme heat seemingly every year. But what we're experiencing now may be among the least disastrous and least hot years of the rest of our lives. Climate change is going to have some serious impacts on people and the economy, and it will almost certainly influence policy across all sectors. But macroeconomic modeling, which informs budgeting all the way up to the federal level and therefore influences the direction of economic policy, doesn't appropriately account for the impacts of climate change. So in a way, we're planning for a future that we know isn't going to happen. We're going to talk about that disconnect and about what's being done and what might be done to better incorporate the risks from climate change into macroeconomic models, so that we can make decisions that reflect the future we're currently on track for. Decisions that, hopefully, help us avoid that future. We'll also talk a little about the so-called transition risks associated with transitioning to a zero-carbon economy, since the transition itself will also influence the economy in ways we need to account for. I'm delighted to be joined by two people whose long-term scholarship focuses on questions of the macroeconomy and whose current positions include work that aims to help improve our policy decisions related to climate change. Gregor Semieniuk is a senior climate change economist at the World Bank on leave from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he is an assistant research professor at the Political Economy Research Institute, Perry, and the Department of Economics. Dr. Semieniuk's work focuses on the political economy of rapid, policy-induced structural change that is required for the transition to a low-carbon economy, considering questions of both financing low-carbon investments and divesting from high-carbon ones, and analyzing the characteristics of stable, equitable growth with climate policy. Tara Sinclair is currently serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Macroeconomics in the Office of Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. She is on detail from her role as a professor of economics and international affairs at the George Washington University. Dr. Sinclair's research focuses on macroeconomic modeling and forecasting. As director of the H.O. Steckler Research Program on Forecasting, she evaluates real-time economic data and forecasts with an eye toward how they can affect policy. I would like to emphasize that both of our speakers and myself, we will all be speaking in our individual capacity rather than as representatives of our institutions. So I'd like to start with some stage setting, and this is a question to both of you. Can you tell us about what brought you to this space? Tara, could you start?
Great, thanks so much, Eric. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Gregor today. So for me, a key part of my role here at Treasury is to contribute to the macroeconomic forecasts of the administration. And as we well know, the changing climate as well as climate policies are playing a larger and larger role in our macroeconomic outlook. So over the past year in this role, I've connected with climate scientists, climate-focused economists, and other researchers to learn ways to better incorporate climate into our macroeconomic forecasts. And that's really what brought me into this conversation, and I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you very much. Gregor?
Yeah, equally a great pleasure to be here. And I just want to preface what I'm saying by the fact that the views that I express here are mine. They do not necessarily represent the views of the World Bank or those of the executive directors of the World Bank or of the governments they represent. With that said, I've been researching climate change economics for the past decade, initially more on the mitigation side, but in how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions so as to mitigate climate change. But now increasingly, the adaptation side, cannot be ignored, how to deal with the negative effects of climate change. And I just joined the World Bank from UMass to bring these insights to bear on the bank's efforts to incorporate climate change into its advice and lending.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to follow up a little bit on what you just said, Gregor, and ask you how you would characterize how climate change is already influencing and how it is likely to continue to influence the economy and going forward.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, climate change is influencing the condition under which economic activity is taking place. And it can influence, the capacity of assets and of people to produce economic value. In short, it can reduce the productive capacity of the economy. For instance, if there's a drought, that can reduce the amount of hydropower that is produced because the water is missing. It can also lead to the shutdown of other plants that lack water for cooling, and of course, reduce agricultural productivity. If there's a heat wave, that can affect people's productivity because they cannot work so hard anymore and make less stuff per hour or per day. Another way in which climate change is influencing the economy is by destroying what has already been produced. For instance, infrastructure that is needed to connect the dots of the economy and transport things and inputs and outputs, or even destroy things that have already been produced and are sitting in a warehouse waiting to be distributed. And of course, all of these things that we have in our daily lives, shelter and maybe cars or public transport. And this kind of destruction of output often occurs in sudden bursts of climate-induced disasters, for instance, hurricanes in the United States. And of course, these disasters can then also affect the productive capacity of the economy because some of the output that is produced is a productive asset that helps produce other things. Now, all of this, of course, can also occur without climate change. We have always had disasters. The problem is that climate change makes them worse. And there's very high scientific consensus on that and great work being done on attributing individual disasters to climate change and other factors. In the future, as the effects of warming play out and the planet warms more, we must expect these adverse effects to increase. One key uncertainty are tipping points, non-linearities, where part of the climate system may move to a different basin of attraction because it has been pushed so far out of its previous equilibrium that it cannot return there. I give you an example of the Amazon rainforest that, if there's a fire, it typically regenerates and grows back. That's what we think. But if there was this tipping point where the Amazon moves out of that, stable state, the fire might actually reduce the forest, and that might lead to more reduction, even without additional reduction of forest cover, even without humans helping it actively along. And if such tipping points are breached, that may also activate additional nonlinearities and exacerbate the effects from climate change in ways that we find very hard to understand today.
Thank you very much for that. And you've given us some arguments for why we would think that climate change is certainly going to make its mark on the macroeconomy. The tipping points that you mentioned could lead to quite dramatic changes. But you also mentioned some that are occurring today that may not be as dramatic, but will still have macroeconomic impacts. But before we get to how to introduce climate into macroeconomic models, I think it would help to have some grounding in how the US government currently does budgeting for agencies and how the models currently work. Tara, could you take us through that, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Eric. Thanks. So I want to focus particularly on the part of the budget process that I'm involved with, because I think that's what most directly connects to this discussion, because that's where the macroeconomic models come in. And what we're focused on is projections for where the economy is going to be in the next 10 years. So we look at a budget window of 1 to 10 years. And our goal is to make sure that these projections are credible. So the process, just to give a little bit of detail, we call it the Troika process because it's organized by 3 agencies: the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, and Treasury. And it actually dates back to 1961. And the whole process is to create a coherent view of the economy from these 3 different agencies. And when we think about a macro forecasting model generally, so first of all, we're trying to use a standard macro forecasting model that's going to be credible in the wider forecasting community. And so we break it up into thinking about a short run window of 0 to 3 years, and then a medium to long run window, which is 4 to 10 years. And then the OMB also extends that out to a 25-year horizon for some of their analysis as well. But it's really important to understand that with macro forecasts, we have very different techniques that we use for effective forecasts in the short run versus the medium to long run. And in both cases, when we're thinking about these sorts of models, we use pretty simple historical relationships most of the time. Now, of course, the minute I say simple historical relationships, those of you who are thinking from the perspective of climate change might be very concerned, because when those relationships are changing over time, and then it's very hard for us to get accurate forecasts. And that's really where part of the challenge comes in. But it's still important that we be able to make these sorts of forecasts for budgeting decisions, because when the government is trying to think about what our future budget is going to be, we've got to know what the tax base is going to look like, where the revenue is going to come from. And this is all in part determined by the macroeconomic conditions we find ourselves in. So if we want to think about what are going to be the needed outlays for unemployment insurance, Medicaid, if we have weak economic conditions versus strong economic conditions in the near term. And then, of course, like what kinds of longer term macroeconomic policies do we need, and what kind of effect will they have on the long run economy really matters for thinking about these medium to long run forecasts. And that's really where you'll see some of the budget forecasts differentiate themselves from forecasts produced by the private sector, because the private sector might be making different assumptions about what policies might be coming into play than what you see from the government. So just to wrap that part up, I want to just highlight that for the budget, we do need specific numbers, and we do have a specific objective of GDP. And of course, for lots of other discussions around macroeconomic modeling, maybe we do want to talk about really better understanding a broader measure of welfare, or we may want to be thinking about more of a much more complex system to model and understand what's going on contemporaneously or what has gone on in the past. But things are different when we're trying to forecast forward, but that's essential for the budget process.
Thank you very much. And that I think between what Gregor put forward and what you just said, it seems clear that it's important to put climate impacts at the very least in there. Another factor of climate transition is the impacts on jobs, on production structure, and so on, and all of those challenges of a zero carbon transition, as well as climate. We're going to get a little later into some of the details, especially the challenges, but I wonder if you could just briefly say, Tara, how the existing models incorporate climate, if at all, including the challenges of a zero carbon transition. Thank you.
Sure. So if we think about the basic troika forecasting model, it doesn't explicitly include climate, although it does include the expected impact of current policies. So there is some role for the climate impact of those policies. And it does somewhat implicitly incorporate some of the expected evolution of the climate in how it affects other macroeconomic variables that do come in and are forecasted, perhaps both from the information we're getting from the private sector, as well as what we're hearing from our own agencies. So even though we don't explicitly model or include climate, it does somewhat get in there. But of course, we would like to see it be incorporated more thoroughly. And so there has been some really important work recently by the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and the Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA. The last 2 years, they've put out white papers that are really making strides towards incorporating climate into forecasts and really drawing on the academic literature to really bring that to bear for our models. But of course, we still face a number of challenges, and I can kind of save that list of challenges for the next bit of discussion.
All right, thank you. And so, Gregor, you hear there is a need for this, an acknowledged need for these sorts of considerations to be brought into macroeconomic modeling. And this is something that you have done from in your work as an academic prior to this. So could you describe in your work how you incorporate climate, including transition risks, into the models you have built, and how might that inform decision making? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm using the risk definition from the IPCC here, the potential for adverse consequences. And at one level, it is very straightforward to incorporate the effects that some of which Tara and also I previously described into a model. Many of these models have a production function or many production functions that relates inputs, typically labor and capital stock, but you can add as many factors as you care, relates these inputs with outputs. So if climate change diminishes inputs or the augmentation of some of these inputs through some representation of productivity, then these are scaled down in the model and you get an impact on your output. So that's not very difficult. And you can also use damage functions that directly affect output and that are in turn related to, for instance, an average temperature rise, or you can become more specific and measure precipitation or changes to some factor that you believe may affect your economy. And this also works when you model output from the expenditure side, as in macroeconomic models and macroeconometric models, and also relevant to the Treasury work. But of course, there are two very, very large challenges to getting this right. First, we're talking about risks, right? The realizations of the impacts are stochastic, with possibly very fat-tailed distributions. So just assuming an average may get you really off the mark. Last year, 30% of Pakistan was literally set underwater by a flood, and and maybe people know that there are flood risks in Pakistan, but if you just assume that maybe every year 1% of Pakistan's land is flooded, then after 30 years, you also have 30% of the land underwater. But it is, of course, completely different from having this all at once. And so, if the model had incorporated this sort of average, maybe, if that is the average, then you would have gotten an underestimate. And, not only that, if we actually knew the mean and the distribution, we could at least, say, well, let's take the extreme values. But the other big challenge is that we often, don't know the distribution of many of these risks, or we don't even know what the risks are that we should be looking at. And we don't know how they change as climate change, affects the world around us. Lastly, they could also interact, and effects on the economy could also interact, because the economy is, of course, a network and not just these things that run in parallel, and it doesn't really matter if one is affected. I mean, another example, an analogy, the Evergreen, the big container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Well, if that was just affecting this one ship, we would have one ship less transporting stuff. It wouldn't really affect the macroeconomy, but it affected the entire shipping through the Suez Canal, and actually had, for weeks, and got backlogs, and then the whole supply chain is affected. And so it had an effect on global trade. This one neural point there. And the worry is, of course, that, climate change could also be hitting such neural points. So all of these uncertainties make it very difficult to come to grips with how to incorporate them. And, Eric, you also asked about transition risks, and I'll say a little bit more about them later on, but, they're also simple and hard. I mean, it's, that probably there'll be less coal mining jobs around under fast transition. That's not very hard to guess, but it's much harder to understand how this may affect the financial system when, bets on fossil fuel companies of their return 20 years hence don't work out the way that investors had thought at the time of investing.
Well, thank you both. I think that you have set the stage very well. I hope the audience now gets a sense, if they hadn't already, of the challenges inherent in incorporating climate into planning models, and also some of the constraints on those planning models. To be useful, they have to provide numbers to plan around, and that means making some choices about some of the scenarios. So there are challenges of representing what is happening first, and challenges of bringing that representation to bear in practical policy planning exercises. And so we'll get into some of this in the next section. I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions at any time through Slido, which is in the box below the video. And please don't wait until the Q&A. Go ahead and put in questions, and the National Academy's team will be valiantly collecting them and preparing them for us. So you've just described how climate change is likely to impact the economy, and how decision-making might change if we were able to incorporate that impact in the models that inform decision-making. But high-level structures can be hard to change, even for those working in high-level roles within those structures. And so I'd like to ask what it looks like to work towards that change. Specifically, what are some of the challenges with incorporating climate into macroeconomic models, and are there ways those challenges might be addressed? And here I'm thinking in terms of technical challenges, which you have certainly spoken to, institutional challenges, and political challenges. Tara, I'll turn to you and ask how you and other decision makers in the government are approaching the challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. So I really do think that this is primarily a technical challenge. It's very clear from the political perspective that there's the will to have this type of analysis, and to have a much clearer role for climate in all of our macro models that we use. the challenge is just, okay, how do we get from that goal to making it workable? And I think Gregor did a fantastic job of kind of detailing out the different ways that we can think about the macroeconomic framework. And so for our longer run forecasts, we do use a production function type approach or a supply side model. So in the end, what we want to do is take all of these very complex climate models and all the insights that we have about how the climate might affect the economy and the different damage functions, but then you feed that in to a pretty simple production function. And the reason we do that is not because we want to have a simple model, but because forecast evaluations for GDP have shown that simple models work better. When you bring in additional complexity, you bring in additional uncertainty as well. And so that additional complexity, it can definitely pay off in other frameworks. But for a particular objective of forecasting GDP out in the future, we have found that simple models work better. And so we're shrinking down all of these really complex relationships to a few key variables, but then that puts a lot of responsibility on getting those few key numbers right. And when we're thinking about how to get those numbers right, and then as Gregor pointed out, then to get those feedback pieces right. And obviously, one thing that climate scientists talk a lot about are these tipping points, and that's something that is really challenging to think about how you want to put that into a budget process. I'm a very risk-averse person personally, and so I always like to think about having worst-case scenario plans and things like that. But if you're wanting to plan a budget, whether it be for the government or whether it be for private enterprise or anywhere else, people usually want more of a median type estimate for those inputs. And so then it can be tricky to communicate the width of uncertainty. It can be tricky to communicate the potential huge risks out there. And that's definitely a challenge that we've seen, that one might be technical / political / just human behavior aspect to this as well. I can nerd out and dig into even more details on that, but I think I'll pass it back over to you for the moment.
All right, thank you very much. Gregor, you were talking about fat-tailed distributions, and Tara is saying what people are asking for is medians. So one moment of the distribution. And also that, yes, there are all these complex processes going on. There are always complex processes going on in terms of actual empirical performance. It's often the simple models that do well. So that's just a couple of points I will bring out, but any points that you want to make as well on this topic about challenges for incorporating climate into macroeconomic models, technical, institutional, political, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to come back a little bit to the transition risks and what complexities and challenges arise for considering them jointly with climate change damages, impacts, and responses to that. So transition risks are the potential for adverse impacts from policies or some other processes that are contributing to a low carbon transition. For instance, regulation that forces sale only of electric vehicles, but maybe also surprising breakthroughs and unexpected cost declines of low carbon technology, and really also consumer preferences. Maybe some people are saying, I don't want to buy certain things anymore, and that all of that brings changes to the economy as it transitions with risks. So what are these risks? For instance, I mentioned coal mining and oil and gas extraction, but it could also be industries linked to the fossil fuel industries themselves, such as internal combustion engine, car manufacturing, or even the petrochemical industry, to the extent that there are low carbon alternatives emerging. And here we have some of these similar issues with the lack of understanding exactly how they play out. And I have already mentioned financial markets where, you can have a relatively small loss somewhere in the economy, and that affects a few investors, but you don't know how these investors are then perhaps linked to others and whether they're very leveraged, and suddenly somewhere else in the system you can have problems. And I think a good illustration of that was when the central bank was raising interest rates, and suddenly some banks in California got into trouble, and it's just, the hallmark of financial trouble is, of course, that you cannot really foresee it, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be no trouble. It wouldn't be a trouble in the first place. The good thing, however, is that transition risks are ultimately likely pretty small compared with the possible physical risks. But since they're more immediate in the sense that, they are often, if a government announces a policy, that something's coming at you. And there are also usually less externalities. That is, some of the impacts are actually priced already, which is good in a way, but you feel it right away. They can show up on people's radars much more readily. And one challenge that arises from that for modeling is that you're trying to maybe bring these two effects together, and you can say, well, there's some transition risks, but aren't they more than made up for by the reduction in potential risks from climate damages? And for partly, I think, historical reasons, many of the current models that evaluate these transition risks, or more generally the effort that's required to transition the economy, don't actually incorporate climate damages. Instead, they're comparing what's called a cost-effective path to mitigating climate change to a certain global average temperature, usually by 2100, with a no climate change baseline. No climate change and no transition action, because why would you do that if there's no climate change? Now, it sounds a bit anachronistic at this point, and of course one has to remember that these models are often years in the making, so you cannot change them from today to tomorrow. But I think one real challenge is to bring back costs from climate damages and costs from mitigation, and also benefits from both, right? Let's not pretend they're only costs. Transition generates new opportunities and more productive things. Electric vehicles are inherently more productive for transporting people around in terms of how much energy that costs actually than combustion cars. So, but these two things would need to be brought together, and models that attempt to quantify the cost of carbon, a price on carbon, the social cost of carbon, in principle do that. They weigh the costs and the benefits. But one problem of the existing slate of models that was also previously in the IPCC and in the noughties, in the fourth or third assessment report, they were still there, but they, you have heard the names of Nordhaus and the DICE model, I'm sure. And then there was Nicholas Stern's model at the London School of Economics. And there was a really big debate about these. And one problem was that there was so much uncertainty, just about the valuation of these future risks. So that brings in the discount rate. And so the bringing everything into one cost-benefit analysis has been proven to be very challenging. And, in addition to that, the social cost of carbon, of course, is also usually derived from some averages. So, once you bring in ranges, you get a huge uncertainty, and it just all becomes very, very complicated. So that's difficult. Nevertheless, it's encouraging that there are now more models that take worst case and not just average case impacts on board. And there are also impacts over time. So for instance, if something happens today, you first need to stand up and get in shape again. You need to rebuild what has been destroyed and so on. So there may be these hysteresis effects over time. And all of that is being incorporated as we speak. And there are very many great people working on this. The same on transition risks. There's a larger variety of models that is being looked at. I give you one example from my own work. where we are looking at actually, and that's not just us, we're standing on the shoulders of many giants here. We're incorporating network effects in the financial system to actually understand better where, losses, transition risk losses in the oil and gas sector may percolate through to, for instance, pension systems or the wealth distribution in other countries that don't even produce oil and gas themselves. I'm done here.
Actually, can I jump in and I just a couple of things that Gregor said just really resonated with me. So the first one, connecting to this, what I would describe as getting the counterfactual right, like recognizing that we are talking about a world that is changing underneath our feet, and that we can't have the climate of yesteryear anymore without policy intervention. So if we think about what the policy role is, we've got to compare that relative to the climate change that is happening, not live in this dream world where climate change is not happening. I think that's incredibly important. At the same time, it's really challenging for us when we're doing that analysis via forecasts, because that is one of the things that we do within the budget process, is we do think about a world without the proposed policies and then with proposed policies, and think about that difference. And you might say this might be a great way to do the analysis of policy impact. But within a forecasting framework, it's not that's really asking a lot of a forecasting model to both achieve the targets of being a good forecast, which tends to rely on a very simplistic model, versus evaluating policy impacts, which might require some much more complex machinery and might do much better in a historical evaluation standpoint rather than in a future-looking standpoint. So, I mean, this is one of the challenges that we have of just having no model being the perfect model, but having to slice it off and use different models. Once we try to pile on different objectives, it becomes very challenging. But I think it's really important to think about that carefully, particularly when we're talking about transition policies, because if people think we're just spending this money and not recognizing that it is really helping us gain improvements relative to what the climate would be without that investment, then we're kind of missing the point there of a lot of those policies. The other thing I just wanted to highlight briefly is Gregor's point about financial risks. And I think this really highlights the fact that these technical problems that we are having with the complexity of climate change for forecasting models isn't completely unique to climate change. There are lots of other things where we have stochastic shocks, where we have tail risk issues. And so one of the hopes that I have is that since we have this motivation behind thinking about climate risks and how we might improve our forecasting models around climate, I hope that we don't just build up that one muscle around forecasting around climate and not actually expand it and improve our forecasting technology across the board, because I think that's first of all, that will even be important for getting climate right, because if we just have one segment of the model well built out but don't have the rest, those feedback effects will matter. But also we want to be improving the forecasts across the board. We want to have better, more accurate budget planning. We want to be able to have a better sense of which policies we should be implementing for the future, because we have a better sense of what the future will be. So just wanted to tag on to those 2 points.
Thank you very much. And we're about at the point where we will turn to audience questions in terms of the timing. I do want to put out one more question for you before we do that, and also just make one observation myself. I'm not going to turn it into a question. I'm just going to note that, Tara, you said that the simple models often perform very well, and then when you get down to the nitty-gritty, sure, you use more specific complex models. But you said in those models, you really have to get the numbers right. For the simpler models, you've really got to get the numbers right. And what I heard you say, Gregor, is you can't get the numbers right because we don't know it, but there are people exploring how to take that uncertainty into account. So I would just say, perhaps this is something, if we have time to return to it and it is of interest to you, perhaps we could. What do you do when you don't know what the right numbers are, but you have some insight into what the processes that generate those numbers? Okay, so I'm just going to ask blue sky question. If you could snap your fingers and make one policy related to macroeconomics and climate change happen instantly, what would you be most interested in making happen? Tara, I'll put you on the spot as someone from the government.
Well, and I'm going to do a classic political pivot here, because rather than a policy proposal, what I'd like to snap my fingers and achieve is to overcome all of these technical hurdles and actually have a sufficiently accurate model of the world that we could use it for both understanding and prediction for the macroeconomy. And that model would incorporate both climate risks and from the physical perspective, as well as a transition perspective, we could have all of the policy impacts in there. Just if we could bring all of the models together into one model, if I could snap my fingers, that's what I would do. I think that would just be marvelous to have. And I think we are making progress towards that. But the progress that we're making is actually by splitting the models up into smaller and smaller pieces so that we can focus on particular goals from each model. That seems to be the path that most of us are going down, rather than being able to come up with one universal model at this stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gregor, do you have a snap and go forward idea?
Yeah, of course. Having been in the ivory tower of academia for decades, I know a lot about all of these nice, wonderful policies that are efficient, effective, just, and so on, if they only could be implemented. And, I think a lot of these policies require, international cooperation, and that's always difficult. But I want to mention here a set of policies that can be implemented at the national level, and so it's maybe more realistic at some level. But you'll see it's still a big order. And basically, what I would like to see are policies that aren't walked back on, that are not retracted, and that you have certainty. So these nice pathways of phasing in certain restrictions on fossil fuels, or having carbon prices, and that they're implemented and then they're there. And I think the reason why I want to bring this up is because a lot of at the end of the day, we still need to mitigate climate change. I mean, it's great to adapt to climate change because that reduces some of the losses, and so makes the budget process less harrowing and so on. And that's great. But if we don't mitigate climate change, it's just going to get worse and worse. So, and for the transition, we really need a lot of investments. The International Energy Agency is great at tabulating some of the global totals, and those are large numbers. We're talking about trillions of US dollars. And investments need to be made upfront. And if you don't know whether you can recoup the investment as a private actor, you might not make them. And that's where the uncertainty comes in. But this is one dimension of uncertainty that in principle governments can take control of to some extent. Now, so try to be as consistent as can be. And that's very hard, of course, in reality, because it's not so easy for governments to be consistent. You have different parties being elected and so on, and things change. And in some sense, there's also this inherent uncertainty in how, for instance, the cost of certain technologies evolve. But still, that would be my finger snapping policy, to remove that uncertainty over which we have more control.
Thank you very much.
Eric, can I just want to jump in once again and say that the implementation, I think Gregor makes an excellent point. And I think that's an area where you're coming from the research world and entering into the policy world. That seems to be the area where it's just like, come on, researchers, like the policy proposal cannot just be this big pie in the sky thing. We need like very clear implementation steps. And so I think that's a really excellent point, Gregor.
Well, and that's a nice segue because there's a question from the audience that is about yet another translation step. As I'm sure you're both aware, there are journalists who specialize in these topics, and they know them deeply, and they write about them normally in columns targeted at them. But this is broader. So what do you think is important for the media to be covering on this topic? So I think I get that from this, that this is more just general. You're saying it's pervasive, so how should that be? And perhaps a related question, what should be translated into more accessible language for people without a technical background of some of the things that you've been discussing? So either of you, any thoughts?
Well, I can start. Well, I think both Tara and I are thinking hard. Or do you want to go first, Tara? All right. Well, in some sense, I would love to ask the question back to the journalist who is, as you say, an expert in this. But from my perspective, what I see is that I think sometimes coverage is often sort of like a little bit focused on one particular issue, and okay, I'm not giving you a good answer here right now, but basically, what I think is that like a lot of what I've been talking about, but also Tara has made it clear that a lot of things go into climate change and into its mitigation. And I think making the links to other topics that are not, immediately related maybe to the event would be helpful. So let me give you an example that is perhaps not a real one, but if there's a new regulation of the government that restricts the use of, let's say, fossil fuel-based heating according to some schedule, what I usually see is that that's the topic, and then the problem is that some people have fossil fuel-based heating, and maybe they only purchased this recently, or there's uncertainty and so on. But what I don't necessarily see is to explain, how that hangs together with the broader picture of mitigating climate change. And so it's kind of a little bit compartmentalized. There's one article, there's terrible news about the worst case climate scenario, and then there's another article that is more about attempts to do a transition, and of course there's opposition to that, and that's that is very understandable, and that's a real social problem. And I would just think that sometimes it's good to make these cross references, and I realize attention spans are short and so on, but I wonder if that can somehow be done more. Again, speaking from my perspective here, not having any clue about the exact process of this implementation.
Well, Gregor, I totally agree that putting it all in context is really helpful when the media do that well. And I think this does kind of bring us back to our discussion earlier about the counterfactual, because we see I think the media has gotten better about talking about climate change and that the historical relative to now, and given more of that context. But I think it's something that could still be reiterated more, because I think it's something that the general public doesn't completely understand, that we can't just have like the climate or the economy of the past, that things are changing, and we need to think about policies in that framework.
But if that was put so much more eloquently than me. Thanks, Tara. And I wanted to add one other aspect, which is maybe, I don't know. So of course, the news stories are what they are, but they have to be covered. But one thing that is quite dear to me is that this resistance to climate policies and to really try to understand where that is coming from, and I think to some extent. This is also important for people in a position like mine to understand. Often people who have the technical knowledge tend to be fairly well off, and also somewhat insulated, maybe not too dependent on a particular fossil fuel technology. And I think it's important also for the researchers and for the policymakers and for the implementers to really understand what are the real problems, because we have such heterogeneous societies, and so so in some sense maybe it goes both ways. So if there are people who are opposed to climate policies, and one can say, why are they not on board? But they have good reasons. It's not just out of a fancy, right? And so I don't know, trying to unbiasedly go in and create news stories about what are the needs and problems of people that are ultimately affected immediately, as I was saying earlier, by transition policies that affect people unequally, and some are better able than others to deal with them. And here again, we're talking about the mean, right? So the mean person in the US can maybe switch to an electric vehicle, but what about those 10% who are driving long distances every day for their livelihood? And there's no simple way to sometimes make a stop and recharge, and then maybe there's some charging infrastructure missing and you take a longer break. That's just me again with an example, but I think that would also be very valuable for a better conversation across the silos.
Well, I think that this really gets to another question that's been posed, actually a set of questions, I think from different people that are all related, that have been posed in the chat. And they come down to those differentiated impacts, fairness, and then another one that I think should be added is the global economy, both our impact there and the impact of the global economy here. And so I'll just put it in terms I'll use the words that were put in these questions, and then you can choose how to answer. So one question: are we trying to separate climate change impacts on the US economy, or also modeling how the entire world economy, which is impacted by climate change, impacts the US economy? Second, how do you incorporate fairness into the models? Say different places have different climate risks. How do you put policies on some places, not others, or decide to burden some places and not others? Or how do you think the idea of fairness in relation, just generally, how do you incorporate fairness into macroeconomic climate policy and policy modeling? And finally, how do macroeconomic models incorporate such issues as loss and damage, including possibly expenditure through climate mitigation funds to equitably support both the global South and historically oppressed communities in the global North? So it could have some fiscal impacts as well as just direct physical impacts. So that's quite a cluster of questions, and any reflections you might have in that area, please go ahead.
Since Gregor gave me time last time to think before I answered, I'll start and then let him have the insightful second remarks. So in terms of the role of the global impact of climate change, this is a big issue, because once again, it adds yet another layer of feedback that we need to get right in order to be able to fully understand relationships, because we do tend to model macroeconomies at the national level, and yet it's very clear that climate change is a global phenomenon that does not have national borders. And so we do want to think about ways, and this is true whether we're talking about forecasting models or more complex macro models, to get a deeper understanding of the interrelationships of climate change and macroeconomic outcomes. A global component is an important piece, but again, it adds yet more complexity to an already challengingly complex system. In terms of thinking about fairness, this is another issue that there are fantastic macro models that do look at different types of heterogeneity and across different locations, different types of individuals. So there's place-based focus, there's individual-based focused models for thinking about impacts. But again, those are very, very complex models. And so in order to get some of that complexity right, they're going to make assumptions on other aspects. And so for, again, budget forecasting purposes, that's not a piece of the puzzle here. We focus on just the U.S. national outcome rather than on the individual components, despite the fact that clearly that's an important piece to understand climate impacts.
Well, thanks, Tara, for going first. Couple of additional reflections. So I would not separate the US and the world economy in an analysis of the impacts of climate change because, apart from the fact that it is important to understand climate change elsewhere, there are also, as Tara already adumbrated, these feedbacks, these interlinkages. If I may go back to the evergreen example, right? That's in the Suez Canal, but it affects the port of LA sooner or later, the other end of the world. And because some parts that were supposed to go maybe to Korea and then on to LA didn't reach in Korea at the time they were supposed to be there, right? And it's the same with climate change. I mean, production and trade, it's all global. And importantly also the effects of climate change elsewhere, especially in societies that are perhaps more dependent on the land for producing output, so more agricultural societies, are more affected and have less capacity to adapt, and that creates migration. And I'm originally from Europe, and I live in the US, and I know that in both areas, the migration is a big topic, a big political topic. So, and the pressures on migration only get bigger with more climate change. So I think those are two areas where it's I think warranted to look globally, even if one wants to focus on a particular economy in some sense. And there are ways to model, of course, these international linkages. So that is possible, even if one models a national economy, and then there's the rest of the world as a technical term. How to incorporate fairness? Well, the textbook economics answer will be, well, we're trying to come up with a good analysis of how things are. And we might also come up with a recommendation, a normative claim about what should be done. And, that normative claim can, in principle, incorporate fairness principles. There's nothing preventing us. So, you can use a model to analyze what's happening, and then somebody has to make a value judgment about what should be done, including about fairness. But I want to go one step further here and say that, it's not that one-way street, because how unequal a society is, for instance, in income or wealth terms or in some other dimension, could affect, right, how an economy reacts to a climate shock, right? If everybody has enough resources to recover from some disaster, that will have different effects on the economy of tomorrow than if only a few % of the populace have, and the rest, has struggles for long term, and that may involve the mechanisms for avoiding that may involve insurance and other redistributive mechanisms. So I think the linkages, and also of course fairness may affect which policies actually pass, right, that are not directed at creating fairness themselves. And of course there's this very long debate about carbon pricing, and there are many good proposals for how to redistribute the revenue that carbon prices, for instance, as taxes are generated, how that could actually lead to a fairer outcome for society. But maybe here, that's again the implementation point. It's not so straightforward necessarily to implement that, since we do not see these policies being implemented everywhere. Loss and damage. Immodestly, I'm pointing to some research we published in Science. It's actually an analysis adding to another analysis that does the same, which calculates, according to different standards of fairness, what would be, fair regional investment shares of the global economy. And if you, for instance, use a capability criterion, how much is a region capable of contributing to the mitigation effort, you get substantial interregional flows from that perspective. So that can, for instance, be modeled and quite quantitatively. And now, as I said earlier, I mean, these are, one can do that. It's a very different question how that is actually happening in the real world. And I mean, here we have the UN process, for instance, and I know that loss and damage is now on the agenda. And there are also efforts, of course, to scale up financing that originates in one region and goes to another. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'm going to turn to a cluster of questions from the audience that is basically asking, is GDP the right measure, especially when we're talking about the climate crisis? And are there other measures of well-being that would be perhaps better guides to policy? And a related question that came up is, the approach does seem to be, well, let's start with the economic model and then see what the implications are for the biosphere. But would it not make more sense to start with the biosphere as a datum and ask what kind of economy can we have consistent with that? So any thoughts?
So I can jump in on this one first, Eric, because I wrestle with this one a lot, because I understand that there are many different things that we want to know about. And we would like a fully integrated model that tells us everything that's going to happen with every different macroeconomic and climate outcome all in one consistent model. And we're very far from that, but I can understand how that's what we would like to have. And so instead what we do is we slice it up into different models with different goals. And so I think it's important to have a model that looks at GDP, because GDP is an important economic outcome that is an input into budget decisions and that sort of thing. But that's not to say that that is the most important outcome to be tracking for welfare. I also agree that we don't want to be thinking about having macroeconomic models where we're trying to jam them together and make them the lead and have climate take some kind of a back seat. I don't think that that's right at all. And I think in lots of ways, climate models are much more advanced in many ways. And so we use the simplicity of macro forecasting models in particular because of the particular objectives that we have, and they perform well for those particular objectives. But I want to be very clear that that's not the only thing that we're looking at. And I think that there are lots of other analyses out there, and perhaps they just need more attention given to them.
Gregor?
In his book, Moving Beyond GDP 2030, Rutger Hoekstra reports that there are hundreds of existing alternatives to GDP, right? So there are all these alternatives. And I really agree with Tara here that I think one reason we gravitate towards GDP is that it reflects something about the world that is important to our society, which does not encompass all the things that are important, and there are splendid critiques of what GDP can and cannot do. But so I think it is one of the right measures, but it shouldn't be the only one. And I want to connect that with the second question, what about the biosphere, and shouldn't we start there? So I think, that is another important measure, if you want, or reality. And here I want to, anyway, I think this is another reason to be maybe very to try to be prudent and think in sort of a precautionary principle way. If our the environment in which we are living changes in such a way that it becomes less hospitable for us, I think that is, or very unhospitable, that is maybe graver than a little bit more or less GDP seen from a very aggregate perspective. And I think we should mention the concept of the planetary boundaries and a safe living space for humanity, safe operating space for humanity. And there are basically climate scientists have identified 9 dimensions in which we need to sort of keep track of if we want to ensure that this safe operating space for humanity that the Earth currently still is, continues to be. And climate change is just one of them. And it's an important one. It's a keystone boundary. You don't want to let climate change get out of hand and focus only on the other ones, but it's also not the only one. So indeed, it's a grand challenge, and one should not only focus on GDP, but then again, GDP is also, I think, for good reason, a key measure, and not sort of just by fluke, and we could just switch to something else, even if we would like to.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left before we hand back to the National Academy staff. So I'm going to ask 2 lightning questions. The first one is, a young economist or a high schooler, anything you would tell them with a little hope, a little hope.
Yeah, no, this is a really fruitful area for research. So I hope that one of the things that we've conveyed today is that we are not stuck, but there is lots of room for further advancement. And so whether it be someone who's just starting to learn about these models or who's been doing research in this area for a while, there's opportunities to contribute and make a difference. And I think it's a really interesting area to do work in. And so I'm really excited to know that there's some young people watching today.
Gregor?
Yeah, what a great question. I think there are a lot of organizations of young people that are concerned with climate change, and there's probably something not far away from where this young person is living. So if they're curious, it's probably a good space to find like-minded minds. And on the employment plane, I think there are jobs in every part of the economy that are related to climate change in some way, but I don't know what are the right resources for this, but maybe that person wants to learn a little bit about, how they can learn to get educated towards a profession that enables them to do meaning, that might give them meaning through their work in terms of working to overcome this challenge that we're facing, or at least mitigate it. And if they are fortunate enough to go to university, to maybe just go to some class, even if it's not in their subject, that I'm sure there's some interdisciplinary class that explains some of these issues. And again, that might be inspiring, and they might find more resources.
Thank you. And then the very last one, the bulk of our audience is practitioners, government, NGOs, industry. Any high-level takeaway that you could give in 30 seconds?
I'm grateful to all the efforts that everybody's doing and for coming and getting informed here. I think it can be both depressing sometimes to read too much, but at the same time, I also feel like all of us, can learn from learning more about this. So I just encourage you to stay abreast and try to not get sidetracked by what I often see on the medias that I follow that are not curated by professional journalists only, so-called social media, that maybe not always the latest on climate science and what we know and can do about it. And thereby also you can identify that, and if you're feeling like it, push back. So that can, again, be difficult to do. So thanks.
Thank you. Tara?
Well, and I just think it's wonderful to know that there are so many people in the policy space that are thinking about these issues. And so really, really glad to know that they're here. And so hopefully we can all connect and we can make that those advancements that we all recognize we need together.
Thank you so much. And Alex, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for your energetic moderation and your contributions. Tara, Gregor, thank you for your perspectives and for the work you're doing in this really important area. For everyone who joined us today, really appreciate you being here and for your numerous questions on this extra technical topic. The conversation was recorded and you can watch it again right away if you didn't want to hear something you didn't hear the first time and learn it the second. Again, please register for our climate newsletter to get updates on all of the climate work, including our October 31st climate conversation on floods in Asia and our November 1st and 2nd workshop on the dynamics of climate and the macroeconomy, which will delve a lot more deeply, if you can believe it, into the topics from today. The links for both of those are also above. And if you'd like to share feedback on our event today or ideas for future events, please take our survey. Finally, thank you to everyone behind the scenes who supported the event, and thanks again to all of you for joining. Take care and have a good one.